Yeah. Hi, I'm Jack. I'm an engineer with InRhythm. If you don't know me, I'm very passionate about this subject. You might even say I got too excited and I had to go pee. It was a whole thing. Um, I want to talk about writing stories because we write stories to describe what we work on in tech, and not everybody does it well because it's really hard. It is really, really hard. I am personally terrible at it. You don't want to see stories that I write. You're gonna see one though, so sorry. Um, Before we get started, I wanted to establish a couple of touch points so that everybody's speaking the same language because we use a lot of jargon in this industry. Uh, Points. We're going to talk about pointing stories. Points are an approximation of time. They're a fuzzy unit of time. Stories are a unit of work. It doesn't matter what the work is. A story is just a description of a singular unit of that work. And epics are a group of stories that are related. So they might be related by who's working on them. They might be related by a larger scale feature. So if you're working on uh, like a new user portal or something for the company that you're at, you might have an epic that's just all the 50, 60 stories related to that user portal. Um, a lot of people seem to think that points are complexity and not time. I just want to nip this one in the bud because if you say that points are complexity, you can see via this very handy flowchart I threw together that the problem with points equals complexity is that you then have to report your points, and no matter where you're at, your PM or your Scrum Master is going to say, okay, great, our team can do 23 points per sprint, and if your sprint is 1 week, then the manager above them is going to go, okay, 23 points per week. 1 point is roughly an hour and a half. So I now know that a point equals an hour and a half. Points are never complexity. We can try really hard, but points always become time. So we're going to talk about the stories. Stories are really hard to write because you have to put a lot into them, but the benefit that you get out of writing good stories is work that is easy and predictable and almost fun. Bad stories come in a lot of varieties. They come in a version that's too short. They're just a headline. They come with no description, so you have a kind of like, hey, I need you to do this work, but then there's not really any details about the work. It's just like, hey, go do the thing, which is like not a great way to communicate what exactly you want. No acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria is a really big deal for me as a developer, for any product people in the audience, and especially for people who are dedicated QA engineers, because if you don't have acceptance criteria to begin with, you don't have a way to determine if you're done with that work. There's no way to say like, yes, we have reached a quantifiable state of doneness. And for the QAs, this is also, if you have good acceptance criteria, your acceptance criteria is basically writing a test for whatever code is going to get written, and you're doing that at the very beginning of your development cycle. So if you have good acceptance criteria, you've already kind of uh, done a bit of the development work and you've done a bit of the QA work, which means that we all get to move on to more interesting stuff sooner. Um, I'm a big proponent of having business goals or reasons in your stories. They don't have to be super deep, but saying, this story is so that we can increase conversions, or this story is because we have a business goal of reducing our page load time. Um, it's good to know why you're working on something. As an engineer, I want to know why I'm working on something, because if I don't have a reason to do what I'm doing, I don't really feel like doing it. And the last one is vague or huge scope. Scope is just how much stuff is inside of one story. It's how much stuff needs to be done. If your scope is not specific, if you're the person writing the story, you're not going to know what you're going to get back. because you didn't say I want exactly A. So you might get back B. And when you're upset about B, your team is going to say, well, you asked for a letter, you didn't say which one. And huge scope. Huge scope is a really big problem because when we talk about pointing and we talk about scope, we talk about fuzzy amounts of time. We talk about brackets of work. It's between a 3 and a 5. It's it's not going to take me all afternoon, but it'll be substantial work. The problem there is that we create a bracket, and the bigger the scope gets, the more stuff you put into a story, the bigger that bracket gets, because when you push things out further, you become less and less sure of what you're pushing out. So huge scope is a problem because you are then deeply uncertain about when something is actually going to get done. And that's a problem. We want to be certain about when something's going to get done. So this is my favorite story that I've ever run into. We have a nice Jira ticket that says, fix the homepage. And that's it. No, don't do that. Like, I don't know what that is. You didn't say what you want. Nobody wins in that situation. That's not a story. Okay? Like, it's categorically not, like, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I want to go back. Like, fix the homepage it doesn't have a beginning. That's just that's a command. It's barely a whole sentence. So don't do that. Write stuff down. This is like my biggest point for story writing. It is very important to write stuff down. Write everything down. It doesn't matter if it's relevant or not, because if you wrote it down and it becomes relevant, then you already did the work. If you don't write things down, then nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows what they're working on, and everyone on the team is encumbered by that. You wind up missing deadlines, which anybody management or product or design leading, deadlines are a much bigger deal for you, and no one wants to miss them because then just everyone's unhappy. When you don't write stuff down, you wind up repeating work. For developers in the audience, I hate repeating myself. Once I work on something, I don't ever want to do it ever again. Like, as an engineer, I should code something once and then code it again in like 6 months when I forgot that I wrote that the first time. People wind up clueless and embarrassed because there's no details, there's no information. And in larger settings, we wind up feeling like we're expected to know what we're doing. You're expected to know what you're going to be doing every day, all day. You're expected to know what you're going to be doing 2 weeks from now. If you don't have any information on what you're going to be doing 2 weeks from now, what are you going to do about that? Embarrass yourself and be like, hey, I'm the idiot in the room who has a question. People tend to avoid doing that. So yeah, just we wind up with everyone upset and confused. You can see that the words upset and confused are on there multiple times. It's because you don't just get like one level of upset. You get like your whole life is affected by this. So we want to write good stories. Good stories are very verbose. They have a lot of details. Good stories are. I did have that as a bullet point. They literally tell a story. A good story that is written to the best of your ability actually comes out as a kind of little novella that says like that, here's a context, here's some stuff that happened in that context, there's a climax that I guess is you doing the work, and then a conclusion. Everybody remembers English class, right? And like good stories have a lot of content to them. They have great acceptance criteria, like I said. The business goals should be there in the story. Don't just assume that everybody remembers what Q3's goals are. Don't assume that everybody remembers that this is an initiative tied to something else. Write it down. It doesn't matter if it's redundant, because when somebody has that question, it's already there for them. And then getting to pointing, good stories are never scoped for more than a day. I can't emphasize this enough. I think a lot of us work in environments where one point is considered a day, maybe a day and a half. A day and a half is a really long time to do a lot of work. Good stories are really, really tiny. Good stories say, I want a button that looks like this. It doesn't include the clicking. It doesn't include how it's going to transpile the form data. Good stories are just like make a button. It's simple, it's tiny, it's super small, and that way we really know where we're at and what we're working on, and work becomes very predictable. So you can't say it'll probably be done next week. You can say I will definitely have this done in 2 hours because it's not that complicated. Uh, and then they really help us to do reporting and to have a pleasant time working. Um, this is my example of a good story. It's not the best, but it's a start. So we still have fixed the homepage, which is fine because that just kind of it's a subject line. It's a reminder of what we're talking about. And then I start out with a bit of a user story that just says why exactly we're doing this work. This middle section here talks about our broken carousel, and there's some typos on the page. And most importantly, it gives background on the task at hand. That background is very, very important because then I don't have to go to Cena or whoever else and say, oh man, like, I got to sign this story, but I don't know, like, where this carousel is, why it's broken, what happened, when did it break. So provide background on what's happening. And then the third section here is my acceptance criteria. I wrote it out verbosely, but if you want to use something like Gherkin syntax, I'm a big fan of that. It provides you a fantastically concise way to describe user interactions. So this is just like our sections of a good story. A good story has a narrative. A good story tells you who's wanting something and why they want it. What's the business goal? Provide as much background information as you can, and provide acceptance criteria. It's not terribly difficult to remember to write out those three things. I wrote this slide in about 10 seconds, so like you can definitely do more in a whole minute. And a minute out of your day is totally worth not having to talk to Karen in marketing. You know, she's kind of weird. So like, and it's relieving. It's relieving to know what you're working on, why you're working on it. It's fantastic. Don't politicize Amy Schumer. It's a good feeling just to be handed something where you just don't have any questions about it. As an engineer, I love getting stories where I'm like, this is awesome. I know what I'm going to do. I know how I'm going to do it. And I know I can get this done in 40 minutes. That's great. But that story wasn't very good. There are problems with this story. I conflated things. There are typos and a carousel in the story. Those should be two different stories. I can do them in the same half an hour, but the typos can be separated from the carousel, so why bother having them in the same one? Why bother growing your scope when you can keep things just brain dead simple? We also, she's just a lovely person. I don't know whether jQuery was actually part of what was going on with my carousel. It's okay to do a little bit of research for your stories. Oftentimes, I've found that if you do research for a story, 10 minutes can eliminate a whole day's work. You can just skip work that you didn't actually need to do because you put in the time to research it before you just said, like, okay, we're going to do this work. Include screenshots. I love when people include screenshots. It makes it so much more clear what is going on. Even if you describe it super well, having a picture, awesome. This is, but there's an official Grumpy Cat store, by the way. I would highly encourage you to go and purchase something. Personally, I have the slippers. They fit great. They're very warm. But I wanted to talk about this because this is the kind of mock-up that I receive all the time. We're gonna this is a contact form where we're gonna put together a new contact form. It's gonna be new. It's gonna be shiny. And here's the mock. And that's kind of the end of the story. Is like, we want a new contact form. Here's the mock. If you're lucky, you work with somebody like Amit who's going to use Sketch and Measure, so you at least know like how many pixels these things are. But this is a gigantic story. Can anybody tell me how long this is going to take to build? I don't care. This is lightning talk. This will take forever to build. I don't know how long because I'm really bad at estimating things. So to write a good story, just write a bunch of different stories. Break everything down as far as you can. And we have, like, there's a menu and it goes places. And this is a screenshot, but you can't see. There's hover effects. That's so much stuff, and it's really hard to anticipate how much stuff that is. So my delivery date for this is going to be somewhere between like November and December. So instead of doing that, we're going to write nice small stories, and I'm going to start with just this input field down here because the input field itself is complicated enough. That is not a browser standard input field, so I need to have like a new component or whatever if you're working in React for a name input field, and it has to be styled to the specification. But then there's placeholder text. That's a whole other thing because we need the floaty placeholder text. I don't know if it's supposed to animate or if it's supposed to go somewhere. And the placeholder text says required if you can't read it. Required means that there's a JavaScript interaction there where we're going to mark stuff and we're going to add event listeners and there's probably some sort of like IE7 thing. So just talking about just that one input field has already taken me a while to describe all of the criteria that I just thought of right now. That you could write 3 stories just for that input field. But if you wrote 3 separate stories for that one input field, I'll tell you what, you're going to know exactly what you need to do to get that code out, and you're going to be able to tell somebody almost precisely when that will be delivered, barring anything horrible happening. If you say, do this whole form page, I'm going to say somewhere in like a month or so, because I don't want to promise early. So yeah, like keep things small. Small is very good in writing stories. It makes Grumpy Cat happy, which you can only legally do with Photoshop. So, like that's a thing. You should do that because everyone wants Grumpy. I mean, he has such a hard life. So my end sequence here is like break it down, write everything, write absolutely everything. If you have an idle thought about like, hey, we might be able to use this input field in another form, write it down because then somebody has that context available. You got to communicate with your coworkers as much as you can. Be as specific as you can and explain why. Why is very important for keeping people happy and healthy and engaged with their jobs and their coworkers. It's great. So go write some good stories. My name is Jack. But you can find me on Slack and Twitter and GitHub and Facebook and LinkedIn and probably some sites I don't really remember anymore. I think I'm the last talk of the night.
You are.
So everybody have a fantastic night, and I hope you learned something.